Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this rainy morning. My name is Neera Tandon. I'm president of the Center for American Progress. I'm really excited to have you here for this critical conversation about the threats to women and families under the Trump administration. Despite repeated promises that Donald Trump and his administration would invest in and empower women, something he talked a lot about on the campaign trail, in these first 100 days, there has been little talk of concrete policy actions that will actually help women and families. And in fact, he's promoted an agenda that really takes us back. Trump's actions have revealed not only a lack of understanding about the interconnected challenges that women face, but also a comprehensive assault on women's progress. These misguided actions are creating damaging consequences for women and their families, especially women of color, and further demonstrate how out of touch this administration is with women's lives. I'll note that Ivanka Trump is in Germany right now to discuss this, and at least the Germans are a little bit more suspicious than some of the American press. Check your Twitter accounts to figure out what I'm talking about. From attacking healthcare and undermining women's legal rights to elevating out-of-touch regressive nominees to key positions, Trump's actions are an aggressive assault on women's rights and equality. Allow me to highlight just some of the issues here. Lowlights, I like to call them. Trump has led an aggressive attack on women's health at home and abroad between pushing a misguided and dangerous health care bill, stripping protections of Title X funding, and reinstating the global gag rule. Trump has also blocked the Fair Pay and Safe Workplace order, which has made it easier for companies with sexual harassment, discrimination, or wage theft violations to keep getting federal contracts. Trump has elevated staff who espouse bigoted and extreme anti-women views and installed the whitest and most male first cabinet since Ronald Reagan. And Trump has also broken his promise not to deport DACA recipients, attack sanctuary cities, place a moratorium on refugees, and pass two versions of a Muslim ban, both of which have been blocked by the courts. Just to show the impact of these assaults on women, we now have reports from both Texas and Los Angeles that Latinas are not reporting rapes because of concerns about deportations. Think about that. In the face of such a regressive agenda, the resistance is working, though. Grassroots energy has led to contentious battles over Neil Gorsuch and even more contentious battles over Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and the withdrawal of Labor Secretary nominee Andrew Pezdur. Since the election, 140 new groups have formed to impose Trump's dangerous agenda. Across the U.S., people are energized like never before. What I'm most optimistic about is that the resistance is being led by women. Women are taking more action, they're making calls, they're going to town halls, and they're running for office. So with this discussion and this background, it's really my great honor to introduce our all-women panel to further discuss this topic. Just to go through them really quickly, Julie Gonin is the Policy Director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, an organization dedicated to the advancement of human and civil rights of LGBTQ people and their families since 1977. Marcella Howell is the founder and executive director of In Our Own Voices, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, a national policy organization designed to elevate the voices of Black women as spokespeople on reproductive health, rights, and justice. Jordan Brooks is the COO of the United States of Women, a megaphone for the gender equality movement, and was instrumental in pulling off the 2016 United States of Women Summit. And Carol Joyner is the director for the Labor Project for Working Families in partnership with Family Values at Work. Carol has worked to address the policy and programmatic solutions for improving workplace standards around the country. We're eager to hear from this panel to discuss all these issues that we've talked about earlier, and so I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'll invite our moderator, Shilpa Phadke, who's the Senior Director for the Women's Initiative at CAP. Great.
Thank you, Nira. So great to see everyone here this morning. It's both exciting and it's sometimes I think we're all just discussing can be sort of depressing as we talk about this 100-day mark and the 100 ways we've identified that the Trump administration has harmed women and families. So we're going to try to just jump right into it. This is a really great panel and we're excited to get started. I think one of the first questions that I wanted to throw out to this group is to really talk about the intersectional nature of women's lives. And Marcella, I look at you for this. You know, we've seen some really dramatic moves on women's health, whether that's, defunding Planned Parenthood, rolling back Title X, gutting healthcare policy. How does this really contribute to the economic insecurity in women's lives? And what are you hearing from some of your members?
Well, I think that the one thing that happens constantly is that when you mention women, people just simply say, okay, here's women's issues. And they're sitting over here and they're about abortion rights, they're about family planning. They might throw in things like, okay, it's also about partner abuse, but they don't get to all the other pieces. And our organization works very clearly on what we call intersectional issues, that we believe that women's lives are not just one silo, that everything intersects. And in this sense, everything that Donald Trump's administration is doing seems to be this outward, ongoing assault on women being able to support their families, women being able to run businesses, women being able to have bodily autonomy and integrity within themselves. And so we see him going after issues around the economy, on pay equality, on child care, on abortion rights, on contraceptive access, all of these things that really do impact on women's lives. But then for our organization, which represents 8 Black women's reproductive justice organizations across the country, we are also looking at things like what Jeff Sessions is doing at the Justice Department, or that should now be called the Injustice Department, as he looks at things like withdrawing from consent decrees that the courts have put on law enforcement, or voting rights issues, or things that he is saying, or the implementation of a new war on drugs. And every time you think about war on drugs, you kind of go, okay, so you're not going after those white gangs that sell meth and cause most of the violence around drugs that we see in this country. You're going after Black and brown communities. And we know that that's true. And it's an attempt to incarcerate more Black men and women, more Hispanic men and women who aren't being deported. First they're deporting them, and then they're going to incarcerate those that are not deported. But it is an attempt to essentially interfere with how Black and brown communities operate. And if you don't feel like you can safely go outside your home, drop your children off, go to court, and report domestic abuse because you might get picked up and deported, then you are basically placing women into this position where they have nowhere to turn. And that's what this administration is really doing. So it is this looking at all of these different sides, and I think people are going to talk about all those different intersections, but we are in a culture war. It's not just sitting in rooms like this talking about policy. This man is literally attempting to turn the clock back on America and make it, his Make America Great is really make America white male again. And we have to face that. We have to face that we all know people who will never admit they voted for Trump anymore, but they did, and we've got to actually, have those kind of conversations with them about what they actually put in place, the company that they are in when they cast that vote, and I think that that's really important.
That's helpful. Jordan, Marcella brought up this great point about immigrant families and sort of the plight of immigrant women right now. I know you did a lot of work on this issue when you were at the Council of Women and Girls. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're hearing from the folks at USOW?
Yeah, so thanks for having us. So we've sort of really realized, we've seen all across the country, immigrant women are being deported, DACA recipients are starting to be deported. We're seeing, refugee women being, separated from their families. And this is really something that, I previously worked in the Obama administration on the White House Council on Women and Girls. And, we did a lot of work to try to make sure that domestic violence survivors and victims of sexual assault and people that were going to report, as Nira was saying just earlier, going to report those issues weren't being deported or picked up or any of those sorts of things. And we're starting to see that. There's a woman in El Paso who was arrested trying to get a protective order in Texas. And so it is really frightening to see that all of these women are starting to be picked up when they're really just trying to protect themselves and their families. And that is not something that we should be continuing to see moving forward. So we're seeing a lot of incredible groups, obviously, led by immigrant women around the country that are really working to work together with domestic violence groups and sexual assault groups to really think through how they can help those women, but also to continue to push policies forward in states and cities to make sure that that's not happening.
Julie, can you talk a little bit about the impact to LGBTQ families in the community and what you've seen in these first 100 days?
Sure. I think to sum it up, I think the actions taken by this administration so far with respect to LGBTQ rights are subtle but sinister. Right? They're not as overt and blatant. They don't stand as proudly on them as they do, for example, when they go after reproductive rights. What we've seen are some moves that might fly below the radar if you're not really paying attention. But I think first you have to start with personnel, which Nira mentioned at the outset. Folks like Jeff Sessions as our Attorney General, Tom Price as our Secretary of HHS. These are folks who, as legislators, were vocal opponents of marriage equality, of hate crimes protections, things like that. I think the one I would probably focus on the most, and this I think goes squarely in the column of the fox guarding the henhouse, is the appointment of Roger Severino to head the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services. One of the key charges of that office is enforcing a really important provision of the Affordable Care Act, the Section 1557 rule, which for the first time ever prevents sex discrimination in healthcare at the federal level. And that obviously has pretty significant implications for LGBT folks. And Severino, when he was in the private sector, was a vocal and outspoken critic of this rule that he is now in charge of enforcing. And we've already seen signals that the enforcement there is going to be rolled back. So the people who are in place are very concerning. They're doing things like quietly erasing, frankly, LGBT content and people. We've seen the removal of LGBT content from various agency websites, the Department of Labor, HUD, USDA. They are removing questions about LGBTQ people from important federal surveys, a couple out of HHS, and then they pulled back from including questions about us in the next census. There have been steps to pull back from enforcing existing non-discrimination laws. We got a really important rule last year out of the Department of Housing and Urban Development saying that homeless shelters that receive federal funding have to treat transgender people according to their gender identity. And while they haven't gotten rid of the rule yet, they quietly pulled back a notice provision that would require shelters to actually post this so that people actually know their rights. So things like this are happening. Probably the moves that are in fact the most blatant have been their attacks actually on transgender people, where that's probably gotten the most attention. They pulled back, rescinded a very important guidance that was issued last year by the Departments of Education and Justice that said that schools had to treat transgender students according to their gender identity. They pulled that back, and they have dropped their litigation against North Carolina's HB2 law. So I think what you see is really an accumulation of actions that, again, while they're not necessarily grabbing headlines, they're not super sexy, they do demonstrate, I think, some real contempt for LGBTQ people.
Carol, do you want to add in? I know you've been thinking a lot about sort of the cross-section and the economic harm to workers and making sure workers have a voice. If you want to talk to some of the things you've been watching.
So it's that, but it's also, just to add to this conversation a bit, the significant attack on working people is seen in the appointments, and people mention that, but more specifically, I believe this week, Alex Acosta will probably be appointed. Appointed will be, yes, appointed. And the fear in the Labor Department is that we're going to see a continued deconstruction of the Labor Department. What does that mean for working families? What does that mean for women? It's significant. And inside the Labor Department, what we saw over the last 8 years is that women had greater access. The Women's Bureau was moving forward with regard to reports and assessing how women are moving in the workplace. We've had tremendous support from the Labor Department over the years in moving work and family policies like paid family leave, grants to states so that they can investigate and do the technical assistance on building out paid family leave programs that are happening all over the country. All of that stands to be threatened. And most of all, the wage and hour division, which protects working women. It says essentially that we're going to make sure that there's FMLA violations, are happening. We'll have enough investigators, we'll have enough funding, we'll have enough support to make sure wage theft claims are heard. And right now what we're seeing in the writing on the wall is that Acosta's not going to protect any of that. And so we're deeply concerned about what's going to happen with the Labor Department. In terms of childcare, there's the proposal right now for childcare under the Trump administration is essentially a tax solution. And a report was done recently that says basically that the tax solution is going to provide so few dollars for working people who really need childcare, something like $5.55 for the average Trump supporter who's low income. But if you live on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, maybe $7,000 a year is your windfall. Like, you really need childcare support if you're living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And so we're really concerned about these types of issues. The whole work and family spectrum, paid family leave, childcare. We're seeing gifts to rich people, to the wealthy, at the expense of poor people. This entire skinny budget, the slashing of every major department, 21% to the Labor Department, to Justice Department, to the Department of Education, you mentioned the civil rights departments, but the civil rights departments in Justice and in the Department of Education are also going to be cut tremendously. And similar to Health and Human Services, they're going to be appointing or have people there who are not going to protect working people. So we're deeply concerned about all of this. Of the 100 days, 100 ways. There's probably like 1,000 ways actually, and we're hoping that we can survive these years and actually get to the place where we can rebuild the government.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to personnel in a minute, but wanted to flag for folks that there is a new CAP report out today on childcare costs that talks about the point that Carol was making, that shows that a typical Trump swing voter would really just benefit, I think it's $5 a year from a childcare plan, as opposed to a family on the Upper East Side, which would benefit roughly $7,400 a year. So we should make sure to read more about that, and we can have handouts later. Carol, one more thing I wanted to really draw out. We've heard a lot about comp time lately. It's been in the news. We hear it might be on the Hill next week. One of the ways in our report really talks about the delays on overtime. Wanted to know if you could just speak to that a little bit.
That's right. So there have been significant delays on the overtime executive order that was signed into law last year. That affects 3.5 or so million women who can benefit from having an increase in overtime. What essentially the overtime executive order said was that we're going to raise the level that where you earn to receive overtime pay, which brings in lots of people who over the years, earned a decent salary but was exempt from overtime. Even includes some managers, so it's based upon your salary. And that meant that 6 million workers overall, 3 million women would actually get a raise, and if they worked overtime, they would be able to receive overtime pay. They're slowing the process and will probably end up figuring out a way to rescind that executive order. That's devastating enough, but add to that that tomorrow, I believe, the Ed and Workforce Committee will be marking up this comp time bill. Now, this is a bill that's been introduced probably every year since I was in college, which is a really long time ago. And essentially what it says is that if you are eligible for overtime pay, you essentially, your employer can decide to use comp time instead of overtime. And that's a decision that they make. You don't have total control over that decision at all. What essentially that means for working women, and for women, particularly those not covered under a collective bargaining agreement, it means that you could work overtime. You could work 450 some odd hours of overtime, begin to clock it at that level, and then your employer say, well, look, we don't really have the manpower or women power for you to take that day off to be with your child. We don't have time for you to take off and use that comp time so you can go to the doctor and care for yourself. We have a story, I drafted a blog the other day about this issue, and one of the people in the blog talked about how, as a public sector worker, they just gave up on requesting overtime, the comp time. They just gave up. They decided, well, we're going to work because we know we have to get the work done. These are public sector workers. They know they have a bottom line. They have to get the work done. If we don't get comp time, we know we're not getting overtime. If we don't get comp time, we'll just, chalk it up and it'll be fine. The truth of the matter is that the public sector workers have been dealing with this for a long time. The bill tomorrow that gets marked up is for everyone else, for the private sector. So the whole nation will have this problem of having to essentially lose valuable time under the guise of a family-friendly law. Essentially, the law is called the Work and Family Flexibility Act. That's the name of the law, because everything is almost opposite of whatever it's described, right? And so it's under the guise of family-friendly. However, it's not at all family-friendly. Essentially, you have to work more hours in order to get time for your family.
I want to loop back very quickly just to talk about personnel one more time, and then I want to talk a little bit more about families. We have seen really the most male, whitest cabinet, I think Nira said, since President Reagan. The administration has really failed to elevate women. What impact does that have, Jordan? And especially coming out of the White House Council on Women and Girls, we haven't really seen any energy around that. It seems to be sidelined a bit. Would love to hear what that organizationally did and just some of your general thoughts on the personnel pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinarily important, obviously, to make sure that there are women and people of color at every table that you're talking about, because you can't be making decisions about women and people of color if there are all white men at a table. It doesn't make any sense. So I think the biggest thing that we saw in the White House Council on Women and Girls was we were able to really bring together representatives from every federal agency, from every department, from every department and inside of the White House as well, to really come together to talk about issues that affected women and girls, and make sure that we were ensuring that all of the policies that were coming out of the government were really the women and girls' lives were considered. And there are still plenty of incredible career employees that are at the federal government, in all of the federal agencies that are doing this work. They're just not in an organized fashion at this point, because we haven't seen anything that's sort of coming out on the Council on Women and Girls. We haven't seen any leadership. We haven't seen any people being appointed to work on that issue. And I think we will continue to monitor and see what happens, and I hope that someone does come in and to work on this issue with those incredible career employees that are working in the federal government, because they're still there doing all of the work, but we really need to make sure that they're working together. And I think, just to your point, the budget really, I think, is completely wrapped into this issue. And when you are cutting federal employees that already exist that are doing this incredible work. You talked about the Department of Education Civil Rights Division. I just think about all of the great work that had been done on behalf of sexual assault survivors over the last several years. And that was really part of the work that we all did from the Council of Women and Girls and the Vice President's Office and the Department of Education and Justice. And that was something that everyone brought together. And I think if you continue to slash departments like that, they'll have to cut even more people when they're continuing to get more reports every day and more investigations that they want to look into on colleges and universities and also on K through 12 institutions, both on the transgender work and on sexual assault. And if we continue to slash those budgets, we won't have any more. In addition to not appointing women and people of color, we will also lose many of those, which I think is extraordinarily problematic.
I also think that the appointments that we have, that we've seen, the problem that we're seeing is that not only is it mostly white males, but it's mostly rich white
That's
males.
right.
Great point.
And I think that is, to me, that's more troubling, is that you've got these people who have all this money, who are coming in to run a country or to run agencies that are supposed to support working Americans, and they clearly don't even have any clue what that means. And so when they're cutting programs or when the budgets are being cut, they think that's fine because what does it mean? Who cares? You know, like we can just simply move along. And as you talked about the funds for childcare and stuff, the disproportionate look of who needs childcare, or even if you remember the health care bill to replace Obamacare, that we still have no clue what the next version will look like. I mean, they were going to cut pediatric care.
Yes.
And then not only were they going to cut pediatric care, then they were going to cut emergency room care. So if your child was sick, you didn't have any coverage to take your child to the doctor, but you also then had to go to emergency care, where right now you can walk into emergency care with a very sick child and get that child taken care of. Now you're going to get a bill instead. So it was the overwhelming thing. And then to hear some of these members of Congress say, well, why should I pay for prenatal care? Why should I pay for pregnancy care? All of those kind of things that everyday people need were things that they didn't even have a clue about why they shouldn't be doing what they did. And it's impossible to explain it to someone who, you know, Betsy DeVos, who has never been to a public school, and the one that she tried to go to, they wouldn't let her come in, which I thought was fairly fascinating. Talk about resistance. But that they have appointed her to be head of an entity that is supposed to support public schools. And she doesn't even believe in public schools.
Right.
And so you've got people like that in all these appointments, somebody who is appointed to the Environmental Protection Agency who doesn't believe that there's climate change problems. And I was watching this thing this morning, where they were talking about icebergs and trying to make sure that all these icebergs have appeared because they've broken off and now they have to go. So there are all these kind of things with these appointments that will turn America backwards. Mm-hmm. And as Carol said, it is going to take a long time to clean all that up, even if this man is only president for 4 years. Mm-hmm. And maybe it'll be less, but even if it's for 4 years, it's going to take us a long time to clean up what they're doing at these agencies.
So how do you think, knowing that your organization has members, how do you think we make sure that women's voices outside of DC, outside of the Beltway, are really heard? If they don't feel, if the people put in these positions and personnel don't feel really representative, how do we make sure that the voices of women and families is really heard loudly?
Well, I think a lot of that is happening now. Mm-hmm. If you look at now, what is happening now is these members go home, and I was looking at the congressional calendar and going, ooh, another recess here, another recess here. And so we send this information out to members, as other people have been doing, to let them know that their members are coming home. And I'm surprised any of these GOP members are even going home anymore, because they're afraid of their constituents now, which is what I think is keeping the pressure, which is what prevented them from passing Trump care, and will prevent them from doing some other things legislatively that we can stop, because these members know that anytime you get, I guess I'm not supposed to talk about election, Georgia, sorry, anytime you get Georgia this close, coming out of that congressional district this close to electing a Democrat outright, they know there's trouble. And it is that kind of activity, the fact that we've got all these, and I don't remember what the number was because you mentioned it, all of these women who are planning on running to office.
11,000 or something. like that we saw from Emily's list.
11,000 women who have gone to Emily's list saying, we want to run. Anytime that's the kind of action that is happening out there, is you've got to hold these members accountable, and that accountability, that the fact that they are afraid to go and have town hall meetings, and we're telling people if they won't hold town hall meetings, go to their offices. Demand to see them or their representatives so that they feel that heat. And I think that that's one of the things we have to keep up, is that every single time they go back to their districts, for work districts, I expect that they're going to start staying in DC personally. But every time they go back home, people have to be there to be in their face and talk about things they're not doing, and tell them that they have to do their job, and tell them that they can't remove their health care, and that they can't remove other things, and they can't. I mean, the fact that we have so many people, almost half of low-income women of reproductive age are on Medicaid. And so many women, especially in the Black community, get their overall health care from Planned Parenthood clinics. All of that needs to be taken into account, and that's the kind of thing that makes people basically go out and say, you cannot take my health care away, you cannot take my child care away, you cannot take my overtime away. That's the kind of, that constant push is what we need.
But also, just to add to that, there's also the proactive work that's going on. So people are in the field, and they're going to town hall meetings, and they're fighting back. And I think we've been hugely successful, given all that's upon us. There's also the proactive work. And so the work that we do in the states lends itself to that, with 24 state coalitions, moving paid family leave and paid sick days policies. What essentially we're seeing over the years of doing this is that we're building political infrastructure in many of those states that certainly need it, particularly some of the states that shifted during the last election cycle. But to run paid sick days campaign, a ballot initiative in Michigan, to move paid family leave in Connecticut or in Montana, to try to maintain the strong FMLA policies they have in Wisconsin. It takes people power on the ground. That's the same people power that will be going to these town hall meetings as they're trying to pass these bills. We'll be building coalitions that are led by women, that are led by people of color in many cases, and that are actually sending a message that is intersectional around, justice issues, as well as work and family issues, as well as economic issues. And so it's that combination, that vibrant combination of fighting for the rights that we deserve, fighting for the policies that we need for our families, that's also going to make a huge difference in the states.
So we're going to turn to questions in a few minutes, but before we do that, wanted to hear from each of you. We're just 100 days in. There's still a long road ahead. We've seen, obviously, incredible intentionality around some of these harms. What worries you the most?
I'm thinking about the courts. We just obviously finished a very high-profile fight over a Supreme Court vacancy that should not have existed in the first place. But there are, the last time I checked, which was last night, I think 121 federal court vacancies, both at the circuit court and the district court level. And most cases don't ever get to the Supreme Court. Those are the truly high-profile cases that deal with conflicts in the law. But most cases in the federal courts will never reach the Supreme Court. So who is sitting on the federal benches below that really, really matters. And because of recent rule changes, it's going to be a lot easier for nominees of this administration to be confirmed, and that's really concerning. I was encouraged that there was a lot of public engagement around the Supreme Court fight, and I would hope that some of that would continue. I think people aren't as used to focusing on court fights, but I think I would love for senators to continue to hear from their constituents about the importance of nominating fair, mainstream judges for these positions. And I think probably the LGBTQ community, maybe more than any other right now, really understands the importance of the courts and the impact on our lives. We've only had marriage equality for just under 2 years now. I mean, that's had a direct impact on my life, on the life of many people that I know, and yet it's not over. There are those who would certainly like to undo marriage equality, but just being able to get married is also not the end of the story. There are efforts underway all over the place to kind of gut all of the things that are supposed to come with marriage. There's a case in Texas litigating whether you should be able to actually get spousal benefits if you're, and this is for state employees. We have a case pending, a petition pending before the Supreme Court right now over whether a state can deny putting 2 same-sex parents on a birth certificate. And there's going to be important cases around the interpretation of federal sex discrimination law that will reach the Supreme Court very soon. So the fact that we have marriage equality is tremendous and important, but it's not the end of the story. And I am concerned about where we're going to go when there are this many vacancies that this president can fill.
Carol?
So I think this is a pretty unfair question. I want to just that no, because there are so many issues, and all of it affects us. But I think I didn't talk about the attack on the labor movement. I talked about a little bit about the Department of Labor and how critical it is to working families. But its mission is about making sure that working families and working people have access, but also the labor movement. What we're seeing over the last 30 years, the attack is only going to intensify. So we dodged a bullet with Friedrichs, right, about a year or two ago, a year and a half ago. And we're going to see a Friedrichs 2 emerge in the courts, I'm sure. And what does that mean for public sector workers? We are 35% of organized labor is the public sector, right? And only 6% is the private sector. And the reason that is the case is because in the public sector, women and people of color are more likely to sign a union card. And also, women and people of color have had access to the middle class largely through the public sector over the last 25 years, 30 years or so. And it'll be devastating to see the end of Davis-Bacon, which is, prevailing wage in public works, right? It will be devastating to see a national right-to-work law that essentially will force unions to, figure out how to collect dues money. We'll figure out whether or not, there'll probably be no collective bargaining. We'll have to create the alternative. When we're seeing some of that begin to emerge in worker centers and other worker-like organizations around the country, but the labor movement still has a pretty powerful structure of the ability to bargain collectively for wages and benefits and protections on the job, as well as work and family policies. It also has a stronghold on political dollars and the ability to fuel campaigns that we all have, benefited from over the years. So there's a serious concern that the labor movement will be able to survive these attacks and that will emerge stronger and better than ever.
Jordan?
So I
Agree with the unfairness, that's fine.
I know. I agree with Carol, only that there are so many things that keep me up at night from, I had a meeting yesterday with some friends on, gutting the evidence-based teen pregnancy prevention grants and, everything from that. But I think the biggest thing that keeps me up at night and that I'm the most worried about is this is just the first 100 days. And we've got many, 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 many more 100 days to come. And I'm terrified that this energy that we're seeing goes away. And so I really want to make sure, and that's what the United States of Women is really trying to do, is trying to both work together in communities across the country and really try to bring together different organizations from Black Lives Matter to the labor movement to healthcare to everyone that's working on progressive issues to really say, how can we work together in communities? How can we continue to celebrate the small wins that we're having in communities? I think we're going to have more of them in states and cities than we're going to on the national level. And I think really trying to figure out the way that we work within all of this incredible energy that we're seeing from women everywhere, but making sure that we continue to give them the tools they need to be able to do those sorts of actions that they're working on. The coalition that Carol works on is incredible, but I think really making sure that we continue to give them more and more things, whether it's from how to advocate on your school board to how to make your community a sanctuary city to, working on a paid leave bill in your community, I think really making sure that we give those women those tools so that they feel like they are armed continually with new things to be able to do. Because my biggest fear is that 6 months from now, everyone goes back to their lives and just says, this is the status quo.
Marcel.
Well, like Carol, I think that's an unfair question too. But, and my response actually is not around the issues that we're working on. My biggest concern is voting rights. Is that with all of these people coming out to these town halls and pushing back at their elected officials, I really do think that there's like, 5 white men somewhere off in a corner in a room plotting how to make voting, take more rights away from more people and at the ballot box. And that there is this, if women are being picked up for going to court to get a protective order around domestic violence, that's a chilling effect to anybody who actually looks like they're Hispanic and has the right to vote to even go to polling places. That if the Justice Department is implementing a new war on drugs, then they are coming after young black men and young Hispanic men, and those people will then end up losing their right to vote because they will be, more charges will be put against them as felonies and things. And so I think that there are things that are going to happen in each of these states, because so much is now work in the states that will basically undermine people's ability to vote. And that's the way, repressive governments stay in place, is they deny people the right to actually remove them. And that's one of my big fears, is that there's not enough groups paying attention to voting rights. I know the Brennan Center is, and supposedly Eric Holder has some new entity that's going to look at that. But I would like him to look a little faster and be a little more active and proactive, and tell the rest of us what the hell he's doing, so that we know how to plug into some of this stuff. Because I do think that that's what we see going into 2018 and 2020.
Great. So I think now we'll shift to questions. Would love to hear a few questions. If you could just state your name and if you're with an organization, the organization you're with.
My name is June O'Connell, and Donald Trump cares about his base. He's not a bridge builder, and he cares about polls. So essentially, as you sit there, you're kind of irrelevant to Donald Trump. But my question is actually about polling and the role that you all could potentially play with people who release polls. So I'm sure you see that lots of polls have said that white high school educated males voted for Donald Trump. I guess there are no white uncollege educated women in those places. They're like women deserts. The polls don't reflect, it's like women are the other, except when they're upper middle class and used to vote Republican. So I wonder whether it's CAP or your organizations, you need to lean on people who release polls to treat women equal, particularly in the areas where there's Donald Trump's base, which is blue-collar men in rural areas, which apparently have no women.
Thanks. Does anyone want to take that?
The only thing I would say about that, and I thank you for the question. I think that for the first time, probably the Republican candidate had the largest share of union households than, since Reagan, and with, it's upwards 40% of white male labor members, union members, voting for Donald Trump. While I agree with you that he cares about his constituents, he's not really caring about that one. And so some of this is, and I don't want to make it seem completely dark, but some of it is, while the polling will help, I think at the end of the day, there's a shifting of wealth. And if you're not only working class. If you're not rich or wealthy, a billionaire, and white and male, then your concerns are not going to be heard, even if you voted for, Donald Trump, which does maybe bode well for 2020. But I do think that there's not a significant sort of attention being paid even to working class people. And you can see as how that gets played out in the appointments and the attack on the labor movement, the attack on the Department of Labor and justice on everything. And
Yeah, that's helpful. Other questions? If you'd state your name, please.
Rose. I'm a member of the much maligned Angry White Males group, and I'm angry at white males in the current administration, particularly the sexual predator in chief. And I'm wondering how to influence more women to come out in the next election, 2018, because that's the time when you need to win back the Congress in order to impeach Trump. So, and I'm also concerned with perhaps a woman who has most influence on Donald Trump, Ivanka. I don't know how much influence she actually has. It appears to me that she's had some influence, and how she can be influenced more. Maybe it's just that she's the last person to speak to him on any issue, but how she can be influenced more perhaps by other women in this country.
Or thanks for the question. Jordan, do you want to take
Yeah, so I would say in terms of 2018, I'm a 501c3, so I will talk about issue-based work, but I think really most of the work that needs to, I think we can really get to people in communities is through issues. I think really making sure we are, to Carol's point, getting women together that haven't come out before, that are, organized now, and making sure that we continue this energy around, there are indivisible groups that are popping up all over the country, which I think is extraordinary. My mom in rural Casanova, New York, has an indivisible group of 3,000 people, or 300 people. It's crazy. So making sure that all of those people are really, really engaged, but continuing to give them issue-based work to work on, because if people are engaged on, Betsy DeVos not supporting public education, people care about that a lot, and that affects their kids. It affects the lives in their communities, and really making sure that we all as organizations continue to give people the resources to be able to talk about those issues in their communities, to be able to understand what it means to, create a roundtable in their community that continues to meet and continues to organize. And it's really going back to grassroots community organizing, which I came out of the first Obama campaign. So that's sort of my bread and butter. And most of the people in this room, I assume, really thinking about how you get people together in their communities to move forward. And then they will be there when we need them in 2018, and to be able to turn them out in a way that I think is really helpful and important.
Yeah, do you want to add?
Well, I was just thinking back to a really interesting thing that I heard following the election. I'm pretty sure it was from Elise Hogue, the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, and it was sort of a debriefing, and I'm sure like many in the room, we were all wondering how could so many women have voted for a man who so openly expressed misogyny. And what she said was that, and this is not necessarily an uplifting observation, but that so many women are so accustomed to dealing with misogyny in their day-to-day lives that it actually wasn't all that extraordinary to them. I think maybe some of us are fortunate enough to live in our lives where we don't see that kind of blatant, I probably need a synonym for misogyny, but that it didn't register and make him disqualifying to women voters, which is a pretty troubling observation. Maybe some of it, and this maybe goes to the first question too, is more making it less about him and more about the rest of his administration, because I think he is in some ways a figurehead. I don't think he cares actually about any part of his base, really. What he cares about is his own reputation and his own brand. He's ceded policy to others in the White House and in these agencies that we've been talking about. That's where the really bad things are happening, and where people who voted for him are going to realize that for the most part, they're not going to get anything good out of this administration. So I think to Jordan's point, we need to really connect the dots for people and let them see that, and somehow maintain this energy so that people can hold their government accountable in whatever way they choose to do that.
I think we have time for one more question. There's one in the back maybe we can fit into.
Hi there. Thanks so much for hosting this. My question is...
And just your name and if you're with an
Stewart,
organization.
no organizational affiliation. My question goes back to this past presidential election and how there is a perception by some that it was a mistake to raise the alarm bells as intensely as we did about the fear of Trump and what type of administration he would create at the exclusion of putting forward a vision of optimism and the type of progressive policies that could really help working families in this country. And my question for all of you is, how do we continue to advance such a progressive vision while also doing so knowing that this tangible harm is being created at the moment, but that doesn't come at the exclusion of seeing what type of other future we could create?
I might start and then feel free to add in. I mean, I think one of the real pieces of that is showing the disconnect between the administration's policies and the lives that most women live, and showing and holding up the progressive proposals and really driving people towards those. So there's an alternative to comp time. There's an alternative, for most of these issues, there are alternatives, and really holding those up and shining a light on what will really move women and families forward, and really highlighting that piece. Would love to hear what you all think.
First, I don't necessarily agree with your premise. That's the first thing. And more importantly, I think that a progressive vision is not, a progressive vision has to include us all. So you can't say we're going to, go after working class people without acknowledging that there are Black working class people, there are Hispanic working class people, there are Asian Pacific working class people, there are women working class people. So working class, unfortunately, in this past election became synonymous with the Klan, the white nationalists. It became something that the media called populism, which is not what Trump was talking about. What he was saying to working class white males was that you aren't getting any better because of the others in our society who are taking your jobs away, who are, doing things to your family, who are after your daughters. All of these problems were lumped on people of color or Muslim Americans. They were all somebody else's fault, which is, synonymous with what Trump does. So it made sense. But for us to take that as okay, now we have to reshape everything we're doing as progressives is a mistake. We work better when we actually point out the issues that progressives stand for. And those issues, you cannot have a progressive party if you deny reproductive health care to women and you say it's okay to trade off abortion rights. You cannot have a progressive party if you say it's okay to trade off workers' rights. You can't have a progressive party if you say it's okay to trade off LGBTQ rights or gender nonconforming rights. All of those are inclusive. This is the fabric of America. And what I think we are in is we are in a battle for the soul of what America is, what America has become, what we thought we were seeing as a future vision until Donald Trump came along. And I think that it's important that we talk to women, we talk to men about what they see as their vision of this America. That's how we're going to keep people involved, in passion. That's how we're going to keep them coming out, is to really paint a picture that says, this is what we stand for as a country. And it's very clear that the rest of the world thinks we're crazy. And that they say, this is what America has stood for, and now all of a sudden it's got this man in charge who doesn't stand for any of this stuff. What's happened to America? And I think that that's what we have to fight for. We are fighting for the soul of this country, and the soul of this country is inclusive. And I think that we have to be very, very clear about that and not shy away from it. And when people go that other path, we need to pull them back and say, no, this is not where we're going. Class without race, without gender, doesn't work. And we have to take people on when they try to separate those things.
I think that's absolutely right. I'm hoping that we can figure out that formula of class and race and gender moving forward and have a very strong, progressive agenda that has policy, clear policy and direction, and make that our message. I feel a little bit like the person who asked the question said that I didn't feel enough in the last election, that we had a strong, clear message around how we're going to move forward. And when you couple that with everything that Marcella said, then you end up with Donald Trump and a slide back into, you know, a racist looking America. And so I'm hoping that we can galvanize, we can learn from what's happening in the States, that we can learn from all of the women in this conversation across the country that came out of the amazing Women's March, and actually create a message that is powerful and strong and clear so that no matter where you live, you can ramp on to that.
Thank you. I think we're a little bit over time, and so with that, would really like to thank our great panel. And we'll stick around for a little bit if people want to catch up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. You guys